Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, June 28th, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about the United States Supreme Court and a voting map that was rejected by the Supreme Court from the state of Alabama, in which they concurred in their majority opinion that the map of Alabama's congressional districts violated the Voting Rights Act and intentionally diluted the power of black voters across the state of Alabama. This comes with a recent decision as well from the Supreme Court in case of North Carolina, in which they rejected the notion that the state Supreme Court cannot overturn a congressional map, upholding the decision of the lower court, indicating that for the future, moving onward, the state Supreme Court, 1, has agency over a congressional map, and 2, that the power of minority voters must not be intentionally diluted by a state legislature, independent commission, whatever it might be, when drawing congressional maps. And the reason why this has such significant implications, as you can tell from the title of this video, that these Supreme Court cases might truly determine the outcome of the 2024 House elections, is because that's how this place works. You see, it begins with Alabama, and then it pours over into the state of Louisiana, where we also saw a dismissal of Louisiana's appeal against their map that initially declared racial gerrymandering, in which the Supreme Court concurred that it did in fact include racial gerrymandering. And it doesn't end there. You move on to the next states, where you see states such as Georgia and Texas with high minority populations, where minority representation is not translating to Congress because of the way the systems are set up, i.e. gerrymandering. So looking at this Alabama Supreme Court case, number one, it came as a shock to many, for the main reason that the Alabama court case that was presented for the Supreme Court was originally supposed to be a decision that could have been made before the midterm elections. But they decided that instead of making an emergency court case decision, that they were going to wait until the next cycle. It was an early indicator that the majority of the court did not want to take up this decision as an emergency one ahead of the 2022 midterm elections, but rather was pushing it off, likely in many people's eyes, to rule against the Voting Rights Act and diluting the power of minority voters across these states. But it came as a surprise to Republicans, Democrats, Independents, that the Supreme Court made the majority opinion that the state of Alabama, alongside many others, essentially, were diluting the power of minority voters. A big win for Democrats across the country. And I will show you exactly how this translates to a Democratic advancement on the congressional map. On your screen right now is the current state of the 2022 House elections in Alabama. This is how redistricting was done, and it was made intentionally to include parts of Birmingham, Alabama, a very high portion of the state's population, with a significant portion of the population being African American. In Montgomery County, you see in this area, this region of the state that holds one of the largest focal points of population for the state of Alabama, again, a huge portion of the populace containing minorities, specifically black voters within the state of Alabama. This came in contrast strongly with the Democratic proposed map in the state that allowed the Republicans to win the overwhelming majority of the districts, 5 out of the 7, but ensured that Democrats would have a competitive district alongside a safe one, as would be declared safe and fair by the newly established Supreme Court precedent. But the Republican state legislature didn't listen to this. They knew they had the power, they knew they had the agency, and they knew that they could all of a sudden just change up the 2022 map and make it so it's 1 for the Democrats and 6 for the Republicans. Keep in mind, Democrats typically get about 35 to 40% of the vote across this state. So for them to have just 1 out of 7 seats never translated into actuality, but the Supreme Court doesn't rule on gerrymandering, but they do rule on racial gerrymandering, which is exactly what happened here. They cracked the epicenters of population, they cracked the black populations across the state, and put them in one singular congressional district. It was intentional, it was made in a way that would allow Republicans to have solid victories regardless of the year. I mean, just look at some of these partisan leans. R plus 65, plus 32, plus 39, plus 36, plus 34, plus 32. They made it so every single district across the state would never be competitive for the next 10 years. And the same thing at least would be similar in the 2024 map, should they adopt a map similar to this one. Right now, they're allowing people to submit petitions, but what it does, at least at the bare minimum, is ensure minority population representation by allowing Democrats to go to Congress in an additional seat. You can see here that they would add an additional Democratic-leaning seat that wouldn't crack parts of Montgomery and parts of Birmingham, but rather would put them in their own separate districts. That alone would allow Democrats an additional seat in the upcoming House elections, should everything else stay the same. And as I said in the beginning of this video, it doesn't just start with Alabama. It starts with a number of states, and you start to see that trend continue, sort of like a snowball effect. Alabama strikes down, Louisiana strikes down, then goes Georgia, then goes Texas, then goes South Carolina, then goes many of the states that are currently be considering right now as states with racial gerrymandering. Louisiana is also an interesting case too, because this is a proposed map by the Democratic Party that gave them the opportunity to have 2 Democratic districts and 4 Republican districts. It would be 4-2. It would be still a very large victory for the GOP. They would have a number of safe districts, but the Democrats would have 2 in their column. Unfortunately for the Democratic Party, the Louisiana Republicans decided to go with this map that was a very clear and intentional racial gerrymander by taking parts of New Orleans and moving it all the way up to Baton Rouge, cracking this major city, 2 cities, and making sure that they are compacted into one singular district was one of the most egregious and obvious parts of racial gerrymandering across the country, and you can see it here clear as day. And the Supreme Court said no. When this map was struck down by a lower court, we will not revert back to the old one, thus upholding a map similar to this one that the Democrats tried to get implemented and tried to enforce through the decision. Louisiana broke the law. And so what we see here is that with this additional seat, we're at 1 in Alabama, we're at another in Louisiana, and you look back on the 2022 House elections and you realize all Democrats need to win back the House majority is just 5 seats. And to remind you of where the House popular vote was back in 2022, Republicans number 1 led in the polls and actually won on Election Day by roughly 3 points. But this 3-point victory doesn't seem like it's coming down the line for 2024. Right now, the generic ballot polling currently shows the Democrats and Republicans tied, which inherently is better for Democrats than being down by 3 points. I'm fascinated, number 1, by the upcoming elections, largely because we will see redistricting not only in these states, but in potentially some others, but largely in favor of the Democratic Party. Another state that's set to have redistricting, not redistricting in the sense of racial gerrymandering, but a big one is the state of New York, where right now they have this map that was enforced by the state Supreme Court, a Democratic majority, might I say. I think it's 5-2 here, but ultimately sided with the GOP, that the map was a gerrymander. The old map that was enforced, you can find to be right here. It was a very substantive one by the Democratic Party. Let's see if we can find what the actual map was. All we know, though, is that in some realities, the Republicans would be winning just 4 seats and Democrats could be winning up to 22. The previously enacted proposal was right here. Let's go ahead and look at it. You see that the Democrats would be solidifying a number of their districts, winning over a bunch of them, and giving Republicans just 4. Well, you can see in the actual map that ended up being a lot more than just 4. Republicans got a baseline 6 with an additional 4 that they could be competitive in. And in 2022, what happened was that the Republicans won not only the competitive seats, but a Democratic seat. You can see from 15 to 11. The Democrats wanted to avoid this, and they can with a new map. And because Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, has been able to nominate a new justice as Chief Justice of the New York Supreme Court, the court now lands in favor of the Democrats who wanted to keep the gerrymander, which means many of these districts that were even won by narrow margins, 0.98, 1.6, 0.64, 3.6, are now going to be turned into districts that Democrats can win, which means that not only is it Alabama adding a district, not only is it Louisiana adding a district, it's also going to be now the state of New York and many others as well. Because it isn't just Louisiana and Alabama that have repercussions because of this Supreme Court decision. It's also states like Wisconsin, where you can make an argument that there is an intentional cracking of minority voters and compacting of minority voters in Wisconsin's 2nd District and Wisconsin's 4th District, allowing the rest of the state to be Republican, which would add potentially an additional 2 seats to the Democratic Party's roster. So if Alabama, Louisiana, Wisconsin alone, you're at 3-4. New York, potential 4 to 5 additional pickups for the Democratic Party. I mean, you're talking about a substantive overhaul of redistricting and congressional maps that allows Democrats a victory because of this Supreme Court decision, and also a Supreme Court in the state of New York. But like I said, I'm not just going to talk about those states. Georgia, for instance, a very obvious compacting of minority voters in the Atlanta metro area and not allowing them to be adequately represented on the map. Georgia is a blue state. 2 blue senators. It's a state that Joe Biden won and is on track to win in 2024 based off of current polling numbers, and it's a state that Democrats are competitive in practically every single election. Even Brian Kemp, the Republican governor, won by 7 points. 7 points doesn't translate to a 9-5 victory in favor of the Republican Party. So being at 9 to 5, the Democrats are at 5 seats, but it means that there potentially could be an inclusion of some more. Georgia's 6th district could return back to being a Democratic district as it was back in 2020. Republicans actually made advancements on their new map. And you can see South Carolina is another state right now where there is this argument being made to the local courts here that South Carolina does not allow minority voters to be adequately represented. Because Jim Clyburn is the only Democrat from the state, it gives them 1 out of 6 in terms of the population. It's a little bit iffy here because minority voters, specifically black voters, make up roughly a fourth of the state's population, but I would still say that argument probably could be made and won by a lower court. It seems marginal. It's an inclusion of an additional seat in South Carolina, Bama, Louisiana, and what you will find, though, is that translates to narrow victories for Democrats that in a race where it is decided if Democrats had won just 5 more seats in 2022, they would have maintained the House majority. It's fascinating, to say the least. But we continue onward. We've talked about Georgia, we've talked about Alabama, we've talked about Louisiana, we've talked about South Carolina. We could also see it happen in the state of Florida, where you have Tallahassee, a significant portion of the state's population that was gerrymandered to make it overwhelmingly Republican. I mean, this map is 20-8. For reference, back in 2018, it was 14-13. So Republicans have completely taken over the state by gerrymandering, completely cracking a majority black district that was protected by the VRA that Ron DeSantis signed into law. Now, Ron DeSantis has a lot of favors from the Florida Supreme Court. They're practically all of his appointees, but it doesn't matter. Because if it's elevated and escalated beyond the Florida Supreme Court, in the hands of the United States Supreme Court, it might take a few years, but they would likely rule down a very similar decision as they did in Alabama, as they did in Louisiana, as they did in North Carolina here, that's going to say that, if there is racial gerrymandering, that they will intervene and call it out for what it is. And that's exactly what's going to happen in many of these states, and it's going to force, by the authority of the United States Supreme Court, the intentional redistricting of many of these states. Now, a bit more on the pipe dream side for Democrats is the state of Texas. Now, I'm not saying that it can't be done, but Texas is this really, really difficult beast to tackle. Because what Democrats are going to argue here is that minority voters are underrepresented within the state of Texas, and at the baseline, they are. Texas is a state that is majority minority. It's one of the very few states in this entire country where minority citizens, whether Hispanic, Black, Asian, whatever it might be, you will find that the non-white population is higher than the white population in the state of Texas. And the fact is, Democrats and minority voters in totality are receiving less than a third, or roughly a third, of the state's population in Congress or representation in Congress. That's a problem. You can see here that there are very, very clear gerrymanders across the state. Let's take this region of the state, for instance. I mean, just take a look at some of the way these boundaries were drawn. It is one of the most intentional and egregious ways of gerrymandering that we have seen across the United States. You can see it here in other pockets of blue pockets where Democrats typically do well, where they tried to pull in more rural parts of the state in order to make Democrats lose in parts of it. I mean, you are finding that the map here has been lopsided so heavily in favor of the GOP that many of these districts are no longer winnable for Democrats as they once were. In 2018, you actually saw a very interesting result where Texas became quite competitive. In 2018, Democrats got 13 to the Republicans' 23, but you can see that in many of the districts, they were well within striking distance of getting a significant more higher population of the seats. For instance, of the states that were decided by low single digits, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That alone would put the Democrats at 19 and the Republicans at 16. So they knew they had to do something by the next election. What they did in time for 2022 was completely gerrymander the state into making sure that the map was extremely safe Republican. You can see the old map here gave an opportunity for Democrats to cross over that majority line had they won competitive districts. The new map made sure that that didn't happen. Yes, they shored up a number of Democratic districts, but realistically speaking, Democrats were going to win it anyway. And honestly, it's not much of a prize to go from 13 to 14, and even then, that's not what happened. Ultimately, what we can take away from Texas is that there was clear gerrymandering. The case now to be made by the Supreme Court in Texas or the National Supreme Court is that it was based off race. We've already seen that established in Alabama, Louisiana, on track to be established in Georgia and South Carolina based on this precedent. We will see what happens, but ultimately, the Supreme Court's decision have given the Democratic Party a very significant amount of opportunities to win back House control in 2024. Obviously not intentionally, but it is by the decree of this highest authority of the courts that there was intentional racist gerrymandering in these states, and it only has proven to be continued to be a very big and prevalent issue historically and currently, and it's something that Democrats are actively fighting back in multiple states, and based off this precedent, I expect them to win every single subsequent court case across the United States, thus allowing Democrats more opportunities for victory and minorities more opportunities for representation. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.